Good evening. I am Alex Halliday. Welcome to our Earth series. Welcome to our Earth series. These are monthly conversations with world-leading experts discussing the urgent issues surrounding the future of the planet and its people and how it impacts us. Columbia is a world leader in climate research, and now we are aiming to take this to a new level. We're building a climate school, which is dedicated to preparing the next generation of climate response leaders ready to address the challenges of our changing planet now and into the future. The school, which is now in the last weeks of our first semester, is doing a lot of things, but it is particularly focused on three main questions. First, how will Earth's climate evolve and change the world? What will be the biggest impacts and where? Second, what does society actually need to look like 10, 30, 100 years, say, from now to limit global warming and adapt to climate change? And third, how are we going to make the necessary transformations? And that's the bit we're really going to talk about today. The climate crisis requires new forms of scholarship, new knowledge, and a deep commitment to change. This demands collaboration, transdisciplinary working. We need teams who can work together across the sciences, social sciences, humanities, medicine, but also with communities, businesses, and cities that are facing the impacts of climate change and its mitigation. So the climate school is open to the world, and we look to engage with the world and learn from the world as we take forward our education, research, and impact programs. The stakes are extremely high. You can just know about this from looking around at what's been happening in the past year, from some of the extremes like the last month's deadly flooding in South Sudan, which was the worst in about 60 years. Or there's the enduring pressure on water systems from the drought in the Western United States, which hasn't gone away. Or the heat dome that we experienced in the Pacific Northwest last summer. So these are big changes, and there are forecasted major further changes going forward with the loss of Arctic sea ice, catastrophic sea level rise, as well as deadly combinations of heat and humidity, which are going to force migration and potentially conflict. So what does it take to stem these things, to stop these impacts and begin to repair the damage of our climate system? And of course, the answer is to do with emissions, reducing emissions, and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. The implications of this are vast and enormous, and they require a huge amount of adjustment. And today we have with us one of the world's leading experts from Columbia University, Jason Bordoff. Jason is co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, and he's also a founding director of the founding director of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. He's a world-renowned expert in this area. Before joining Columbia, Jason served as special assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate change on the staff of the National Security Council in the Obama White House. He previously worked at the Brookings Institute and served in the Treasury Department in the administration of President Clinton. So welcome, Jason. Wonderful to have you here. You're no stranger to me, of course. But it's actually really wonderful to actually have this opportunity to do this one-on-one with you, with another several hundred people. So Jason, maybe you could kick off by just telling us a little bit about what led you to actually get into the whole subject of energy and society.
Well, I think if you're interested in environment and economics and national security, there are few topics that bring all those things together the way that energy does. Maybe it was something kind of in the family growing up too. My dad, who told me yesterday he was watching, so he's probably watching right now.
Oh, great.
Owned auto repair shops, and his dad a gas station before that. My mom is from the Middle East, which I think led for me a desire to study Middle East politics in my graduate work. And you can't really study the Middle East without understanding the role that energy plays in geopolitics and foreign policy, and then combining that with a strong commitment in my upbringing and a strong passion for thinking about the environment around you. Energy just brings those things together in a really powerful and fascinating way. So I think that's kind of what led me to think all the time about our energy system.
That's great. So now, of course, the issues around energy are changing at a fast pace. And you and I were both at COP in Glasgow, COP26, which I found amazing, and partly because it's such a big gathering of people from around the world, from different walks of life, all focused on the climate crisis and how we're going to do things differently in the future, or maybe not. What were your takeaways from COP? Do you feel more optimistic or more pessimistic having been?
More optimistic, but it's maybe a little bit of a close call. I think there were a lot of successful outcomes from COP and things we should celebrate. And I think we'll look back on this COP and see the significant role that the private sector and private finance played in their commitments as being consequential. You saw really important issues that many people have worked for a long time to put higher on the agenda, like methane emissions, which are a very powerful short-term warmer. Those were high on the agenda and received significant commitments to try to curb methane emissions. The general increase in ambition, the commitments that many companies and countries made to take stronger action in their NDCs, their 2030 pledges, or their mid-century 2050, 2060 sort of targets. And I think more than anything else, if you go back pre-Paris, we were on a pathway for somewhere, I don't know, around 3.5, 4 degrees Celsius warming. There's uncertainty about that. It could be much worse. If you look on the pathway now, we're somewhere even before the improvements in the pledges that were in Glasgow, a little below 3 degrees. So it is a demonstration that progress is possible. The outlook today is not good, but it is not as bad as maybe we thought it would be 10 or 15 years ago. So it is possible to get on a lower carbon trajectory. We just have to do much more to get on an even lower carbon trajectory. And I think the thing that worried me was Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, rightly pointed out on Twitter that if you take all of the mid-century targets, net zero by 2050 or 2060 or 2070, it puts you on a pathway for 1.8 degrees Celsius. And so below 2 degrees. It would be wrong to think we're on a pathway for that today. We're nowhere close to being on that pathway. So if you take the 2030 NDC commitments coming out of Glasgow, that would put you on a pathway for 2.4 degrees Celsius warming by mid-century. But you have to take, at least with some grain of salt, whether there's a likelihood we will achieve those targets. The US has a commitment to get to 50 to 52% reduction by 2030 relative to 2005. Hopefully we will see a over $500 billion in spending package passed in Washington that'll do a lot to advance clean energy. It doesn't get you all the way to that target. So even in our own domestic political environment, we're not on a pathway yet, even if that passes, to achieve those. So if not all of those are guaranteed to be achieved, and then certainly all the 2050 targets that people are committing to right now, we don't have the technology and policy measures in place to get there. So it's good that ambition is rising, but at the same time, the gap between ambition and reality is rising, not shrinking, because the ambition's rising, but the reality is not changing yet. Oil use is going up, gas use is going up. Coal is doing great right now, and it's, I don't think it's going to continue, but maybe it'll plateau. It's not falling off a cliff. We're not moving beyond coal as quickly as we need to. So that's the reality of today's energy system. It's not on track with what these commitments suggest we should be doing.
So what will it take to get on track?
Well, it takes a lot. It takes, obviously, I wouldn't be running, in addition to working with you to build the climate school, also having built something at Columbia, the Center on Global Energy Policy, with the word policy in it, if I didn't think policy was really important. We do need stronger policy, and we need governments around the world to put much stronger measures in place to create the right incentives so that people, businesses, consumers, invest in different kinds of products and produce and consume energy very differently in the future. There's also clearly a role for the private sector and for private finance, and it's good to see the commitments from many financial institutions to try to put their trillions of dollars in capital that they're putting to work on a more sustainable path. We need technological advancement as well. We have many of the tools that we need. It's remarkable how much battery costs have come down, more than 90% in the last decade, solar more than 90%, wind costs have fallen dramatically. But somewhere around half of the emission reductions between now and 2050 in a net zero by 2050 scenario will need to come from technologies that are not yet available at commercial scale for things that are harder to decarbonize, that may not be possible to electrify. If you think about steel and cement, and not just cars and transportation, but ships and planes, there's a lot of things that we know what some of those technological solutions might look like carbon capture or removal or hydrogen or ammonia, or maybe things we don't know about yet. But we need those technologies. So we need a lot of technological innovation to get to commercial scale. And I think we need to just we need to be honest with ourselves about the challenge, about how hard this is. You look at the share of new vehicles sold that are electric in Norway, for example, and that's gone from almost nothing to, I think it's about 70% now. Just you go look at a chart and you'll see a line going straight up over the last decade. And then look at oil demand in Norway, and it's a flat line, it's unchanged. Because it's really hard, and most of oil is not used by cars. It takes time for the vehicle fleet to turn over. We have around the world growing GDP, growing population. Those things in the past have driven what kind of increases we're going to see in energy use. So as countries get wealthier, as population grows, Africa is going from 1 to 2 billion people between now and 2050. The world needs more energy, not less. And even if we do as much as we should, and we're not doing nearly enough with energy efficiency. So it's not easy, and we have a lot of work we still need to do, even though there's a lot more solutions available to us, because it's remarkable how much, say, renewables have come down and how quickly we can scale those. They compete favorably now against fossil fuels in many places, even without government subsidies.
I mean, you raised Africa, and that segues into the next question, really, which is, you wrote, just before COP, you wrote a foreign policy piece about the energy needs of developing nations, and a major focus for the activities of the Climate School and for the Center on Global Energy Policy at COP was the energy and climate challenge in the global south. Why that focus in particular? What's so important about it?
Yeah, as you say, we did a lot of work in Glasgow on many issues, but we worked with the Development Finance Corporation, with USAID. We have a partnership with SE for All, the UN Sustainable Energy for All coalition. We're among the leadership council of that organization. And just incredibly important as a matter of decarbonization, but also as a matter of equity and justice, and how to think about, people around the world who have no access to energy at all, or very, very low levels of access to energy. So I think I mentioned a minute ago how to think, about how optimistic one should be about the potential to deploy, say, renewables, how much the costs have come down. The electric vehicle outlook is so much brighter now. That's really positive, but we always want to be skating to where the puck is going. What do we need to be talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Let's start talking about it now rather than then. And if you look at, say, the continent of Africa, which is using very little energy today, is responsible for very few emissions, and certainly historical emissions. What matters for climate is not the annual flow, but the stock cumulative total. The US and the EU combined are about half of the cumulative emissions to date since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The entire continent of Africa, 2%. So this is a part of the world that has not caused the problem, will suffer some of the worst impacts of the problem, has the fewest resources to deal with the impacts of climate change, and to deal with what costs there may be to decarbonize, to move in a cleaner energy direction, and maybe invest in highways and roads and bridges with green steel or green cement. Those things are more expensive today, not less. Maybe that'll change at some point, but we're far away from there. And we need huge amounts of capital going into that. And it's parts of the world, about 800 million people today don't have any energy access at all. And when you model what it means to give them energy access, that's often kind of counted in models as the amount of energy it takes to turn on light bulbs or charge cell phones. But if you say just a fraction of the standard of living we take for granted, cars, refrigerators, air conditioners, the numbers are huge. These are really big numbers in terms of growth in energy. And we need to figure out how to not only decarbonize the amount of energy the world's using today, but meet that growth in energy with zero carbon forms of energy. It's a really significant challenge, and it requires requires a lot of capital. So if you look at the estimates of how much additional spending needs to go into clean energy, you're talking about somewhere in the order of $1 to $2 trillion a year in finance going into developing and emerging economies between now and 2050 per year. Last year, by comparison, it was 150 billion. The developed countries in Copenhagen pledged 100 billion a year in climate finance assistance to developing countries, and not only have they failed to make good on that. I mean, that's a rounding error compared to the amount of capital that needs to be put to work. So I think it's important for us to think about this issue because it's critical to meeting the climate challenge and to helping people around the world deal with the impacts of climate change and enjoy, again, just even a fraction of the prosperity many of us take for granted, which energy makes possible.
So I'm impressed that you're optimistic. How do you explain? I mean, there are some paradoxical things we deal with around the climate crisis issue, and in particular, how we work with oil and gas companies. So, how do you explain Biden administration's strong commitment to climate action, decision not to issue new oil and gas leases on public lands, but at the same time, its complaints that OPEC is not producing enough oil and pump prices are too high? You would think actually pump prices being too high would actually be quite good from the point of view of the drive towards renewables. Can you give us a perspective on this from you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And just today, there were reports in Bloomberg that as soon as tomorrow, potentially, the Biden administration may announce that it's releasing oil from the U.S. strategic petroleum reserves in order to tamp down gasoline prices. So I think the last thing you said is correct, which is you want to send the right price signals to people. You want to, in economic speak, internalize social costs every time you're doing some activity that's using fossil fuel energy. You're emitting a ton of CO2 in the air that is harm to society and to others, and you should. A good policy would bear that cost. That's kind of the theory of the case behind a carbon price, whether it's in the form of a carbon tax or something else. So that would be a reason to support higher fuel, a carbon tax or a gasoline tax that raises the price of gasoline. I think there's a difference between a policy driver that leads to that outcome, like a carbon tax or a gasoline tax, because first of all, that's determined by the government, and also it generates government revenue that can then be used either to redistribute it to low and middle income consumers to offset what can be a regressive impact of higher energy costs. You can use it to invest in clean energy or something else that you decide is socially worthwhile. That's different from high market prices, forcing a market crunch so that energy prices or gasoline prices go up substantially, and the beneficiary of that then would be a country or a company, whoever's benefiting from higher energy prices. So I don't think it's inconsistent to view those two things differently. And then I think there's a reality of the world we have today and the world we want in the future. And the world we have today is one that is still using huge amounts of fossil fuel energy. And I don't think it needs to be inconsistent to say we want affordable and reliable energy supplies today for consumers, which helps people in their pocketbook. It helps the economy. It helps families that worry about paying the bills every month, their heating bills or filling up at the pump, and taking the strongest measures in history to try to change our energy system in the future, which I think is what this administration is doing with the Build Back Better Act, $555 billion, significant subsidies and other incentives for electric vehicle charging, building out an electric vehicle fleet. Government procurement can help drive that. So taking incredibly strong measures to try to say we want a different future down the road when you think about something like oil dependence than we have today. I think the broader point that underlies your question is something I actually worry and think about, which is we have the world today. We have the world we need in the future, which is net zero emissions. And the path to get from here to there is going to be messy and unpredictable. I mean, why would you think you could take this share of the global economy, the energy sector, and turn it on its head in a really short time frame? If you look at the work of Václav Smil and others, 3 decades is really fast by historical standards when you think about an energy transition. and have it. Why would you think it would be smooth and predictable and linear? We're going to go from Obama to Trump to Biden. We're going to get things wrong when we anticipate what might happen to cost curves and technological improvements. If we need to think about ways to de-risk that process of transition, because if it is volatile, if it leads to periodic market crunches, and I think what we're seeing in Europe and Asia now with this gas crisis, where energy prices went through the roof, is not primarily the result of climate policy, but it is a reminder that if you get things wrong in how you manage this transition, it may lead to volatility, and that can be politically damaging. It can be economically damaging. It can be geopolitically damaging. And if we don't deal with that kind of volatility, if we don't help smooth the path to a lower carbon economy, if people feel rightly or wrongly, in reality or perception, that this transition is hurting them economically, it's going to be very hard to sustain political support for that transition. I think that's part of what you're seeing in some of the polling and why the administration is concerned politically as well as economically about how people will react to higher gasoline prices. So as a matter of policy, I think we need to think about more, not fewer tools to sort of smooth volatility in the years ahead, because this is going to be an uncertain and messy and disruptive transition. We're not going to get it all exactly right.
So, the gap is still huge, and regardless of the complexity, it feels very often as if we're going in the wrong direction in terms of the overall amount increases in CO2 emissions. What would it take to get what's needed in terms of stronger policy, as well as technology breakthroughs, financial flows, all of this stuff that we need to make this work? What's going to be, like I said, it kind of feels such an enormous task, and it's not just one thing; it's several things that actually have got to, that are all enormous, So, what do you see as the way that what will it take to actually make this really work?
Yeah, I just came from a really interesting faculty talk down the street at SEPA, where my faculty appointment is, talking about the history of the Clean Air Act and how it came to be law in the sort of seminal environmental laws of the early 1970s, and the history of that in the 50s and 60s, the Great Smog of London, the some severe pollution incidents here in the U.S. too, and then famous things like the Cuyahoga River catching on fire and stuff, and what the political reality was in early 1970s when Richard Nixon signed many of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, created the Council on Environmental Quality, not because he necessarily was a great environmentalist, but it made good political sense. There was very strong support. We had reached this moment, the first Earth Day, of course, April 1970, when 1 out of every 10 Americans came into the street across urban and suburban, Republican and Democrat. I mean, it was just kind of a collective moment when the country said, we just can't live like this anymore. We can't have water that we can't drink, and lakes we can't swim in, and rivers that are polluted, and air we can't breathe. You just have to do something about this. It has to stop. The famous American economist Herbert Stein once said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And that's sort of how I feel about climate change. The problem is when, and when it's going to happen quickly enough. I said earlier how the gap between ambition and reality is growing. The level of urgency, the level of ambition. Look, we're in New York City. Go down to Wall Street, talk to the financial community. The conversation they're having about climate is orders of magnitude different. But the reality is not changing nearly as fast yet. So that ambition-reality gap, something I spend a lot of time thinking about. How does it reach a breaking point? You roll the clock forward a few years. If that gap continues, this is the decisive decade. You want to think about what it means to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. You're kind of running out of carbon budget by the end of this decade. So things have to change pretty quickly. So you roll the clock forward, 3 years, 5 years, whatever the time frame is, and if that's not changing, one of the two has to give. The reality has to give, or the ambition has to give. And either you believe we're going to wake up later this decade and say, you know what, this was just a lot harder than we thought, and I know we were ambitious, but it's just too difficult, and we just have to settle for, 3 degrees or whatever it is. We're just not going to get there. I look at the students we work with every day, the sense of urgency among young people on this problem, how the polling is changing, particularly among younger demographics, and of course the climate impacts we're seeing each and every day, which are becoming more and more evident to more and more people. It is hard for me to see how that suddenly the ambition is going to be the thing that gives. If it's not, the reality has to give. And you're kind of running out of time for that. So that starts to look like more drastic and more severe and more rapid changes in what it means to really curb oil, gas, and coal use much, much more rapidly than the sort of smooth pathways that we might have modeled in years past, and what kind of policy measures it takes to really change that. And I think maybe you reach some moment when that consensus finally comes together and you have strong enough political support to take the kind of really stringent climate action we need, strong enough mobilization of consumer preferences or social support that business practices have to change. We're getting there. I don't know that we're there yet. I mean, you just look in the reality in Washington and what it was like to try to build support for climate legislation in this Congress. We're not there yet. But I see that coming given the poll. If you poll the American people, climate. I think the most recent poll I saw, what issue is most important to you? Climate was number 2 now. That's a huge change from where it was not long ago, and that again is certainly true among the younger demographics. So I think that pressure is building, and that will give us some of the urgency we need to take the steps we need in technology, in policy, in finance, all the things you mentioned, and they're all, of course, interlinked. If you have stronger policy, you have more incentive to invest in the different technologies and bring the cost down of new technologies. Again, the way policy helped be the driver that brought down the cost of solar, wind, batteries as much as it did.
So, I mean, that brings us to the subject of money, and how much we need. So, it's clear we need to invest a lot more in clean energy and these new technologies if we are to reach net zero by 2050. Can you give us some idea of how much money that is? How much more do we need to invest? You could just give us the context for the amount so we get some idea, some framing of it.
Well, the International Energy Agency did this really helpful exercise. It got a lot of attention, particularly for the kind of headline takeaway that in a world that was on track for net zero by 2050, you would not need to invest in new oil and gas supply. That made a lot of headlines, but it was a very helpful roadmap for understanding if you're gonna keep saying net zero 2050 all the time. Companies are promising it every day and then buying forest offsets or something. Countries are promising to do that. Well, let's really understand what we're talking about, and here's what it means. So there are different pathways, but broadly speaking, there's helped us understand what it would really take to get there. And we can come back to different pieces of it because it's, they're pretty ambitious. We have like 100 new nuclear plants between now and 2030. You take the world's largest solar park that exists today. We need to build one of those every day for the next 30 years. There were some takeaways from that report that are sobering.
Sorry, can you just say that again, Jason? Because it's pretty staggering. Say that again.
The largest solar park in the world today, if you take their projections for how much solar energy the world would need, you're building one of those every day for the next 30 years in the Net Zero 2050 report. And a lot of measures on energy efficiency and behavioral change, because the energy infrastructure takes so long to turn over. There's a limit to what you can do, say, in the next decade. But we need to start bringing emissions down in the next decade. So how do you do that unless you're cash for clunkers scrapping all the existing vehicles? Maybe we should do that. But they had a lot of other energy efficiency and behavioral changes and cycling and other things like that built in. So it was, again, a sobering reminder, as it should be. You want a sobering reminder. Think about the fact that we shut down half the global economy last year at the high point. It was a low point, meaning, in response to the pandemic, we literally shut down, at one point, more than half the global population was on economic lockdown. And global carbon emissions fell 5% last year. We need emissions to fall 8% every year for the next decade to be on track. So that's a sobering reminder of how difficult this is. And we need a lot of capital. So particularly because clean energy is more CapEx intensive, it's more capital intensive, and lower operating costs. Think of it as a solar farm or something. You're building it, and then the solar energy is basically free. but you have to invest the money up front. You don't have the fuel costs on an ongoing basis the way you do with oil or natural gas. So annual spending on energy today, I think according to the IEA, is $2 trillion a year. In their net zero 2050 scenario, that needs to grow over time to $5 trillion a year. So somewhere in the order of $100 trillion between now and 2050 of additional investment in clean energy is what we're talking about. And so I think now there's a lot that sounds like a big number, but there's no lack of capital in the world. I mean, there's a lot. There are trillions of dollars being put to work. We just need to figure out what the policy and financial and technological drivers will be to move that in a different direction. So these are pretty big numbers. But something we should be spending a lot of time thinking about as a climate community is where's that money going to come from? And we hosted during Climate Week, which Columbia Climate School was sort of the official university partner of Mark Carney here on campus. And I think he was asked this question, and he said, I think he said around 2/3 or 3/4 of it would be private finance. Most will be private, not public. And most, around 2/3, is going to be in the developing world and the emerging markets, not the developed world. So something we spend a lot of time thinking about, the Center on Global Energy Policy, and many of us at the Climate School, is how do we think about the tools that government has, the tools of public finance or other government tools of international economics and trade and foreign policy that can help catalyze that private capital and that kind of spending. If we need a lot more private capital from infrastructure investment funds and others going into clean energy projects in emerging markets in Southeast Asia, go to countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, what are the barriers today? The currency risks, the political stability risks or concerns, the unfamiliarity with financing clean energy projects in certain emerging market and developing economies, the unfamiliarity of local banks. There's a set of barriers, and I think it's really incumbent on all of us to be kind of thinking about the steps we can take, whether it's multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, and governments, to try to help overcome those, because we need a lot more capital going into that space.
So, so given all the policy, finance, technology, geopolitical challenges that we're facing that you just described, why are you spending your time building a new climate school? I mean, tell us all about this, because of course I know the answer, but what should you tell everybody else?
Well, it is, it's a softball question of sorts, but it is, I will admit, I've said this to President Bollinger, it was not obvious to me when I thought about leaving the Obama White House to go work on policy issues that a university would be the best place to do it. And I actually talked to a lot of people at think tanks and universities and some private sector places. And what is so exciting about what Columbia has been doing, about President Bollinger's vision broadly speaking, but also the climate school and what we're working with our colleagues to build, Alex, is when I was a policymaker, what I was looking for every single day was the most objective, rigorous evidence that would help one figure out how to understand a problem and design the best policy solutions to it. And there are many great think tanks out there. There are some not great ones too. But universities are just unique in their rigor, in their depth. I mean, you look across an institution like this with, a dozen or 20 people studying where battery chemistry is going, and the extraordinary climate science work being done at Lamont and my colleagues at the whole thing is just extraordinary. How do you take that expertise and develop institutional capabilities so that you can take that knowledge and make it useful to the people who are making decisions every day that are going to determine what our energy future and climate future looks like, whether the people who are designing policy, the people who are putting capital to work downtown on the other end of Manhattan Island, or something else. So I think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity to think about how to bring all of the aspects of different climate problems together. I mean, you and I have talked before about, if you think about something like, for hard to abate sectors like steel or cement or something else, do we think tools like hydrogen or ammonia, green hydrogen or ammonia, may need to be part of that solution? Well, very possibly so. So then we need to bring the cost of those technologies down. So it would be cheaper and better electrolyzers. We need to think about the business models that are going to make sense for them and how to finance them. We need to think about the policy enablers that are going to incentivize people to build it in a green way instead of a not green way. There are all sorts of equity and justice concerns. There are reasons the environmental justice community is understandably concerned about certain technologies like carbon removal and what it might mean to continue to allow extractive industries in their communities. There may be geopolitical implications, but my own area of interest is kind of the geopolitics of the energy transition. Putting under one roof, not siloing the way academic disciplines usually operate, but putting all of that under one roof so we can put teams together to tackle these problems, I think is a really incredibly exciting idea. And then with a commitment as we have to try to institutionalize the capability for external engagement, partnership, and impact in a university like this is a very unique sort of thing. And then, of course, the most obvious answer to your question is we need the next generation of leaders to succeed where we may have failed. And of course, the thing that is most inspiring about doing this work every day are the extraordinary young people. Had two on my podcast, as you heard last week, who joined the meeting with President Obama that you and I were privileged to sit in the corner at while he had that roundtable in Glasgow with youth activists. We need a lot more people to understand this problem, be committed to it, and understand all the ways in which you can engage in it in civil society, in government, in the private sector, in finance. And so educating those leaders is something I'm really committed to as well. And of course, that's what we're doing at the Climate School with our inaugural class of master's students that's hopefully some are watching right now.
Okay, so that brings, so we're going to run out of time if we're not careful, so I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. But a couple of important questions, which the master students are really keen to sort of focus on, is the whole issue of justice and climate justice. Can you say a little bit about what you think responsibility of the developed world, the developed countries, is to the developing world when it comes to climate?
Yeah, and of course, I think a lot about that problem a lot, and of course, it is only one aspect of climate justice. There are the climate impacts and what agricultural workers in California. There are making sure that the costs of climate policy are distributed equitably. We talked a moment ago about something like carbon tax could have a regressive impact if you're not careful in how you design it. There are communities that may be dislocated by the transition itself. If you think about coal communities or something, and how to think about making sure that people in those communities have a viable path toward other economic opportunities. What I mentioned a minute ago with the potential for clean energy technologies to have unintended consequences, like how you might think about carbon capture or carbon removal technologies in certain communities. So all of and I'm forgetting, there are many other aspects too. One aspect of climate justice is what you asked about, which is how to think about historical responsibility, historical missions. That was a big issue in COP. Of course, it was highlighted especially by the fact that many people from the developing world had trouble even attending because we're in the middle of a pandemic that is highlighting the global inequities. It's just frustrating as an understatement to say we're unable to build consensus for vaccinating people here, and there are parts of the world that would be desperate to get vaccinated so they could participate in meetings like that. So I think, I mentioned a minute ago the statistics where historical emissions have come from the inability of developed countries to make good on a $100 billion a year pledge in climate finance. And as I said earlier, that's just a rounding error. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about loss and damage in the next year. The next COP is in Africa. That'll be especially in Egypt, especially on the agenda. So I think we collectively do have a responsibility to think about the tools that are available to us to help to think about what's going to catalyze the capital around the world, the investment, the finance, and think about how to make sure that people can both cope with the impacts of climate and develop a clean energy pathway for themselves in parts of the world that historically have not contributed to emissions.
Okay, so we're going to have a couple more questions, then we should. And the last question I'm going to ask you is going to be about, what is the one takeaway you would have for this community of listeners we've got with us today, who are going to be taking from in a minute. But before we get on to that, what is it about Columbia University that makes it the ideal place for the climate school, from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, so part of it for me was I knew when I left the White House I wanted to come back to New York, and you can't grow up in New York certainly, but anywhere without sort of look idealizing what happens here on this campus. And so it was a privilege to be able to come back and be a part of the Columbia faculty when I left government. But you know, I think it's what I said a moment ago, which is to tackle so many of these problems, you need to bring so many different areas of expertise and disciplines together: technology and science and finance and social work and social justice and law and permitting and regulation and policy. And Columbia, we're in New York City. We have the finance community in our backyard. We have the United Nations in our backyard. And under President Bollinger in particular, you know, this university has become even more global with a network of 9, 10, I can't forget how many global centers that we have around the world. So we're really fortunate to have an administration here that is highly engaged with addressing the climate crisis, and our boss, President Bollinger, is deeply committed to this problem, to this issue, and to, you know, taking advantage of the fact that we are in this hub of New York to lead on this. So it's a really exciting opportunity to try to build something that brings all of these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. These are terms that get thrown around pretty loosely, but and I worked for 5-6 years at the Brookings Institution. As you said, it's an extraordinary think tank, brilliant people there. You simply don't have the depth of expertise and research capability across an entire school of engineering. If you're trying, the New York Times this weekend had this whole deep dive on critical minerals. You know, I responded on Twitter to make a comment about it, and what I said is what may be missing in that article is how battery chemistries are going to evolve, and maybe we won't need as much cobalt in the future. I think I know something about that, maybe I don't, just because I've spent so much time with extraordinary colleagues like Dan Steingart and a bunch of others in the engineering department who are spending all their time as the leading battery experts in the world. It's a very unique environment to just have that depth of expertise across so many areas.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's amazing because it is the transdisciplinary way of working is amazing. It's fantastic to be in New York, but we've got these fantastic engineering schools. We've got a brilliant CEPA, your school. Now you've got 2 schools, but CEPA has been astonishing in terms of the expertise it's been able to bring on this area as well. So the global trajectory for climate action coming out of COP, how do you feel about where we're going? We're going to have to wrap this up very quickly, Jason. So just give me a quick couple of lines on that, and then I want
it's getting better, but not good enough, right? That's the short answer to your question. And so I sort of gave some of the numbers a minute ago. If you take all the 20, 30 pledges seriously, and I think there's a reason to maybe be a little skeptical about them, even that would put you on a track for 2.4 degrees Celsius. So we have a lot more work to do. I do think that it's clear the global community is feeling the urgency, the level of urgency, and I will say the level of optimism, maybe not all of it, and some of it you could argue misplaced, maybe it was overly optimistic, but the level of optimism that we're at a moment when this transition is finally going to get underway in a meaningful sense was much more palpable at this COP than in previous ones I've attended. So if governments take their pledges seriously and we build on them to put further, stronger measures in place, particularly with policy, but in other ways too, to back them up, then we might be able to look back on Glasgow as a turning point. And what we need to do moving forward is celebrate the elevated ambition and now make sure the reality catches up to that ambition.
What's going to be, okay, so your one takeaway message for everybody before we go to the Q&A that you would most want our audience to understand?
Well, I was looking at a slide earlier for a presentation. Maybe I'll put it up in 2 seconds, because I think if I was to show with my class one slide, I show something like this. Yep. And what you see here on the left is what people think of when they think of an energy transition. You see, going back to 1850, these great shifts over time from wood to coal and coal to oil and oil to gas, and increasingly, although still small, renewables. These numbers are a little out of date. But on the right is the same exact data, not as a share of the total, but total BTUs, total energy use. And you can see we've never really used less of anything. And this comes back to the point I made earlier about the very clear relationship over time between GDP growth and population growth and energy use. The denominator's getting bigger. We're using more energy. So the challenge of decarbonization is not just to take the share of the global energy mix that is fossil fuels, which is about 80%, and it's been at 80% for decades, and bring that to zero, either by not using those fuels or otherwise capturing or removing the CO2, but it is to meet all of the growth in energy demand with clean and zero carbon sources of energy. And that really is historically unprecedented, right? Again, the title here, the history of energy, is not about clean energy transitions, it's about clean energy additions. We've met growing demand with new and cleaner forms of energy. We haven't actually stopped using the stuff we were using before. So it just helps to put the scale of the challenge in perspective. And I think we have to take that really seriously and struggle with it as we think about what the solutions might be.
Yep, great. Okay, well, thank you very much. So we've got some cracking questions in already, which if you thought you were in for an easy time, sorry. So the first one is, and we're going to have to go through these quite quickly because I suspect there's a lot of them lining up. Very few nations are currently responsible for a vast majority of fossil fuel emissions. They could taper fossil fuel licenses and permits down aggressively in the next decade. What's stopping them from taking that approach?
Well, I think if I heard the question right, there's sort of two pieces of it. One, are very few are responsible for emissions in terms of their own emissions, like how much fossil fuels they're using. And then there's also a question of people continuing to issue licenses to produce fossil fuels. They may use that energy at home, or they may export it, or something else. And I think, when we talked about how to think about climate justice, how to think about it in the developing world like Africa. One comment I've often heard African leaders make is, to the extent there is some carbon budget left, and there's, we don't get off of oil and gas overnight, it's going to take some period of time. Even a net zero world is still using some oil and gas, as the IEA told us. Maybe we should get to develop those resources rather than Texas or somewhere else, because, let us monetize those. So I think people think in their own individual sense of what they're trying to achieve when it comes to production. And then we're still facing a lot of challenges in trying to think about how to meet growing energy demand and finance that, and do it all with zero carbon energy alone. That's why you still see Southeast Asia building hundreds of coal plants, and we need to kind of really quickly make sure that those don't happen and we're able to meet those with clean energy instead.
So a second question, what are the ways Columbia University is researching the practical possibility of reaching net zero globally by 2050? Are there sufficient resources, planetary carbon budget money, and time remaining to reach this goal? So there's two questions there, really.
For not, you don't mean for Columbia, you mean for the, globally, to meet net zero 2050.
Well, so the first thing is, what is Columbia University doing to come up with practical ways of achieving this? And are there sufficient resources, et cetera, remaining to reach this goal?
Yeah, look, I think the answer is yes. I mean, obviously, we're building a climate school, and that's maybe not a sufficient answer, but I do think I built a center here at SEPA. There's lots of initiatives, centers, institutes. There aren't that many schools. There's a law school and a business school and a medical school. It is the largest commitment that a university can make to any given topic. And so the fact that we are creating an entire school focused on climate is a major commitment. And you heard me talk a little bit about how we're trying to bring different disciplines together to make sure it is academic research, but that it is really turned into actionable solutions as well. And that's my background. My background is in policy. It's not a career in academia before coming here. So it's something I'm really focused on. We can do this. I mean, if anything, again, the optimism coming out of Glasgow or anything else is, look at the tremendous progress we made with renewable energy, with batteries, with electrification of the vehicle fleet. We can definitely do this. But it's not easy. I don't think it's going to happen all by itself. I've heard some people say the clean energy transition is unstoppable. Clean energy costs are falling so quickly. You don't even need government anymore. It's just going to happen. I don't think that's true. I think we still need stronger policy support. We need financial incentives, and we need technological innovation. We need all those things.
Yeah, I think in terms of what it is that Columbia is doing practically. I mean, we've got an amazing engineering school that's growing at a phenomenal rate, with a particular focus on the challenges of society, in particular around climate and energy. So I think there's tons of exciting opportunity. But the practical thing, which is something the school brings, is plugging that technology into things like policy and law and the right kind of regulatory framework we need to really have something that technology that's really actionable and can be utilized. So that's the real opportunity we've got here, which I think is incredibly important. So sorry, I'm going to get this is your gig, not mine. So another tough question here: how do the manufacturing and construction carbon footprints of the various zero carbon power generators compare? Wind, solar, and nuclear all require carbon release during manufacturing and construction. What are the trade-offs?
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's a good question. We shouldn't pretend. I mean, most things are not fully zero carbon. If you're going to build the materials for solar or for wind turbines or for nuclear power plants or anything else, there are emissions associated with that construction. We can bring those down over time with new materials and new advances. Most of the emissions you're thinking about are from the actual running of the plant and generation of the electricity. So if you were to compare a wind farm or a nuclear power plant to a coal plant on a life cycle basis, you're getting nearly all the emissions are coming from the fuel that's used. So that should not prevent us from deploying the zero carbon tools that we have as quickly as we can. And then at the same time, many people at Columbia and elsewhere, and many companies now, it was actually really interesting at COP to see how much more focus there was on some of these hard to abate sectors, as they're called, and what real solutions might look like to get to lower carbon steel or cement or some things, so that we can build all the things we need, not just energy technologies, but cars and factories for other things, and our homes and the new Columbia Climate School building or something else. We can do that in a way that minimizes the life cycle emissions because we have lower carbon materials. We're not fully there yet, but that's an area for research. But it shouldn't stop us from putting that to work today.
Yeah. So another good question here. A lot of people are asking about electric cars. Some limitations to widespread adoption are the lack of charging stations and the sustainability of batteries. How are we going to move more people to adopt electric cars in this context?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think I have an electric car. I love it. It's not always easiest. I mean, if you're taking a long drive somewhere, it is a little more difficult today than having an internal combustion engine and filling up at the gas station. That's definitely true. There's a little more planning involved. So we definitely do need a broader network of electric vehicle charging. And I think there are I do spend a lot of time also, like when I said before, we need to de-risk the transition. What are the things we don't think enough about that might make it harder to get where we need to go than we think? And so you think about a world where there is relatively small number of electric cars, maybe an electric car is your second car, not your first car, and you have issues with reliability of the electric grid, right? California recently, because of wildfire risk and other things, rolling blackouts to try to prevent that. If all the cars were electric and that was your only way to get around, that would be a real barrier for people. So we need to improve the reliability of the electric grid, the electricity system. Even with the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, the cyber attack, I think the electricity system, some of our colleagues have shown, is more vulnerable to cyber risk. There are the materials and the critical minerals, as we talked about the New York Times story this weekend. And over time, if you think not just about a little bit of growth in electric vehicles, not to mention electrification of other parts of the economy, but really scaling that up on a global basis, the amount of critical minerals you're talking about is just staggering. It's huge. So you can address that through improvements in technology that allow for substitutes. Again, using iron or more plentiful materials, and there's work on battery chemistries, through recycling of materials, and also obviously we'll, I think, find more of those deposits than the world knows about today. So there'll be some increase in production as well. All of those things can help, but we do need to think about how a decarbonized world is certainly going to be a much more electrified world. And that presents many benefits, but there are some risks that come along with that too. And we need to think about reliability, vulnerability of the electric grid, and try to increase the resilience of it if we're going to facilitate that transition.
Yeah. So there's many more questions I could ask you about that, but one last question, and then we should start to wrap this up, I think, depending on how quickly you answer. Nuclear energy. What is the role of nuclear energy in reaching net zero, and what's your perspective on that?
My perspective is we need all hands on deck, all tools at our disposal, and I worry we're still going to fall short. And so I think the bipartisan infrastructure bill included incentives to prevent the early retirement of nuclear power in the US. There was a study by some academics at MIT recently that showed that if you take the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California and extend its lifetime for another decade, that would lead to lower emissions, and it would actually lead to lower costs. The track record, we obviously have very high profile and catastrophic events like Fukushima and Chernobyl. The track record for nuclear on the whole is relatively safe, and I think we do have the potential to see improvements in technology. We'll see what happens with TerraPower, the Bill Gates plant that is being built in Wyoming, and some other advanced nuclear technologies that there's a lot of focus on now, and I'm hopeful will bear some fruit. And I think all of the analyses that I've seen, Princeton has done great work on this, and many others, to get to a net zero economy and a world that is much more electrified. Not only to decarbonize the electricity we use today, you need more electricity, 2 or 3 times as much in a net zero world. It is much cheaper to do that when you have some degree of zero carbon firm baseload, electricity that can run any time of the year, whenever you need it to. And so I think nuclear can play a role in that. And I don't know if we're going to see a lot of growth in new nuclear in the US, but I think around the world, if you think what it looks like to get to net zero emissions globally, you are going to see significant growth in nuclear power in a world that achieves our net zero 2050 targets. I mentioned the IEA net zero 2050 report. The IEA, in their modeling, in their scenario, says we'd roughly double the amount of nuclear power in the world between now and 2050 if we achieve net zero 2050.
Right. Yeah, indeed. Okay, so Jason, this is great, and I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank you so much for the discussion. It was really punchy, tons of stuff we packed in, and amazing to hear you speak in this way so clearly. I'd like to thank the audience as well for joining us from wherever you are. This is an urgent time, and we are building the climate school in the context of trying to work really fast and really hard to address the climate crisis with whatever we can bring to bear on the issues. So any help you can give us in terms of making a gift would be fantastically helpful. Your support leads directly to new knowledge about the climate system, how it is impacting our planet, and what we need to do about it. So your support is immensely appreciated, and it'll advance the climate school and also support our students who are going to be the future climate solution leaders. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. I'm wishing you all a safe and joyful holiday season, because we won't see you until next year. Again, please look for our invitation in the new year for the lineup for our spring semester 2022 Earth series. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thanks, Alex.